my takeaway on all this, you got to find people that know what the hell they're doing, that have done it time and time again, that have a formula. And then obviously all the personal stuff. Do you like them? Are they people of character that you can trust and all that kind of stuff? But looking for people that really have a lot of experience doing what they're doing.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. And RCB & Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com. Hello and welcome to episode 298. My guest today is a successful entrepreneur and real estate investor who hosts the excellent podcast called Street Smart Success. Roger Becker is also a great guy, and he's not afraid to share the ups and downs of the deals he's done, which include single family, commercial properties, and a rent-controlled multifamily in San Francisco. Well, Roger, welcome to the show.
Brian, thanks a lot for having me, and I am flattered. And those aren't just bromides and platitudes. I mean that.
Talk about your history as an entrepreneur, and then we'll kind of segue into real estate.
So when I started as an entrepreneur, I was 27. I had been working in radio for 5 years, selling radio advertising. And the extent of my vision at that age, and I was living and working in San Francisco, the extent of my vision and what I wanted to achieve is I just wanted to work out of my house by myself. That was the mission and the vision. In other words, I had no mission and no vision, but I was going to start an ad agency of which I had zero experience in. And that's what I did. And, I've been doing it for over 30 years, and it took me about 13 years to find a great niche, but a lot of stubbing my toe and skinning my knees and all the other cliches. It was hard, very, very, very hard. But I eventually found a niche doing advertising for vocational schools, people that teach the trades or heating and air conditioning, welding, airplane mechanics, or to be a nurse or a medical assistant. And there were great niche because they operate pretty much on a local basis. And for a small boutique ad agency, they spend a fortune.
Is that still what you're doing? And then you kind of started investing in real estate on the side, or what's the mix there between that business and real estate?
I don't run the day-to-day. There's a gentleman that runs the day-to-day business, and this has been the case for the last 5 years. Back when even before I started my business, I was reading the newspaper, the esteemed San Francisco Chronicle, and this is a long time ago. This was in the 80s, and I remember reading an article that real estate prices in San Francisco, and this was for single family homes, real estate prices were up 20% year over year, whatever the year was that I read that. And I actually think it was 1986. I was making like $49,000 a year that year. And the average home price in San Francisco was $400,000. And so I'm thinking, holy cow, that's, if you just own the average house, you were making more in appreciation than I was, my full-time salary. And so little this, little that, but I went out and bought a duplex in 1991 for $400,000.
Okay. 1991 San Francisco duplex for $400,000. Let's go with that. What was that like buying that first duplex, and how did you make out on that?
So I lived in one. It was a full rehab. I did some part-time rehab stuff when I was in college, and I was on a scale of 1 to 10. My skills, I would rate somewhere around, negative 600 trillion. I couldn't even hold a hammer. I had no business doing that. But nonetheless, the guy that I worked for, who was also my landlord at the time, this is back in Cincinnati, Ohio, he had moved out to the West Coast as well, and he did the whole rehab by himself. So it was on budget, on time. And I'll tell you what, for many years, I wasn't making enough off my primary income to pay for the mortgage. My rent on the upstairs was like $1,250 a month. And I don't remember what my note was, but yeah, I couldn't afford it. And I had inherited some stock from my mother who had passed away. Not a big portfolio, but I was like selling stocks to pay my mortgage. And I was watching my little net worth go down to zero. So to answer your question, what was it like? There was some pain, there was some agony. And then I remember I started turning my business around in the mid 90s, the late 90s. And I remember a real estate agent telling me, well, your property is probably worth like $700,000. And I had never asked anybody in that whole time. I wasn't into real estate. It wasn't in my consciousness at all. And I'd paid $400,000 in the early years. I couldn't even pay the mortgage. So I was like, wow, really? $700,000. At the peak of, I would say at the height, going back pre-COVID, it was probably worth, it was worth between 2.8 million and 3 million. Then I sold it when COVID, hit because the rents were plummeting, and just the return on my equity was so abysmal, which it had been for years as it had appreciated like crazy. But I was really risk averse to go into a 1031 and exchange it. And, so I just kept, it was making, I don't know what, maybe 40, 50 grand, 60 grand a year, which, was less than 2% return on my equity. But I justified it by, just saying, hey, you know what? It's going to keep going up over years. And, there was 5 million square feet of office space being built in San Francisco. And I'm like, these people where are they going to live? San Francisco is actually a small place. People don't know that. Thinking this thing is going to just keep going up over time. And so with the whole work from home thing, kind of calls that into question.
So you actually sold it then within the past year?
I did. Yeah, I did. I sold it for 2.3. It
sounds like you were living in it when you first bought it. You were living in it and rehabbing it at the same time?
Yeah. Well, the rehab probably only took, it's a long time ago, but maybe 3 months or so. But yes, I was living in it for the first 9 years that I owned it.
So it's a true house hack. I'm sure that wasn't the term you used back then, but you house hacked. You lived in one side and rented out the other side.
Yeah, up and down, but yes, small detail.
And you were losing money, but were you at least breaking even on what you would have been paying for rent somewhere else on what you were paying for your mortgage on that duplex?
There's an underlying assumption in your question that I was actually smart enough to even think that through. So I don't even know. It's a hard one. Probably not. To be honest, I probably was, if I would have looked at it in those terms, probably not. Because I could have rented something back then because I did need a certain amount of space because I was working out of my house. So I needed an office and a bedroom. So no, probably not. I probably was it would have required less out of pocket if I were renting.
But the big payoff was the appreciation, because you were in San Francisco, which is a high appreciation market. And just the value that's been added over the years, even though you sold it during a pandemic, you still made out like crazy on that.
Literally beyond my absolute wildest dreams. I mean, I put 80 grand down. The rehab cost me 30 grand. So I was in into 110 grand. And, so, I mean, that was like, a 30 bagger, right, over time, for sure. And I used to, in the early 90s, a lot of people were too young to know this recession, but it was brutal, the recession in the early 90s. And I mean, I used to just, I've always been obsessed with retirement since I was in my, early 30s. And I used to think to myself that, come hell or high water, the worst case scenario. And I never was thinking about getting married for some reason, which I ended up doing and having kids and all that. But that was never on my horizon either. But, I was thinking, worst comes to worst, 30 years from now, when this mortgage is paid off, it'll double in value. And this was a very arbitrary thing. I don't know why I figured doubled in value. So I'm thinking, I'll owe nothing. It'll be worth 800 grand. That'll be my retirement. And even then I'm thinking, how could this possibly be worth 800 grand? That's so much money. And so, yeah, to your point, yeah, no question about it. It beyond my wildest imagination. And, I think that the tech companies made people a lot of money here. I mean, Google, Apple, they're all here. And I think that it just made real estate just go through the roof.
It's a very, very different market than what you find in most other places around the country. Let's talk about that for a moment, because I know that even before the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about how San Francisco was a bubble market. If you look around the country, real estate is local. So you could look at a lot of markets and say, well, it's not really in a bubble because it's the inflation, the asset inflation has not gone up that much. But you could point to San Francisco and say, wow, that's really outsized in the increase in values there. That's got to deflate at some point. Talk a little bit about those dynamics. What has happened in San Francisco? Where is the market now? And where do you see it in the next couple of years?
I don't agree with that. And I'll tell you why. It's a two-part question. So let's go pre-pandemic. Is that, again, a lot of people don't know this, but San Francisco's 49 square miles, 800,000 people live there, right? So it's actually a small city, and 70% are renters, right? So I figured out that there's probably sub 200,000 single family residences in San Francisco. And that's not exact, but that's ballpark, probably 170, 75 to 200. And that includes condos, single family houses, et cetera. And the reality is you just have so much money here. You have, again, let's go pre-pandemic. You had money coming out of Asia. It has become over the years an international destination. And you've got all of the tech companies are here now, not literally all, but if you think of a tech company, whether it's Uber, it's Lyft, it's Intel, it's Sun Microsystems, it's Apple, it's Google, it's YouTube, it's, the list goes on and on and on and on. They're here. Oracle, not to mention all the new ones that will be spun off of those and et cetera. So it's supply and demand, and the interest rates have been low. And in a way, the market here is not tethered to economic fundamentals like a lot of other markets are. And you've got all these IPOs that have been happening so you've got a lot of 32-year-old kids walking around with several $1 million. And that's what I mean, untethered to, incomes, economic, basic economic fundamentals. So I think prior to pandemic, so reality sets in at some point. So it's not a, fairy tale and forever. But I think it would have been sustainable at the rate that it was at. Now, post-pandemic, ironically enough, the single family homes in San Francisco, the market is very strong. It's not gone down. Because you've got a tale of two cities. The renter class, when they talk about everybody's leaving California, everybody's leaving San Francisco, there's truth to that, in my estimation, based on what I read. And, my ear is to the ground because I live here. It's a tale of two cities. Yes, the renters have moved, but the owner class, not so much. So the single family market is crazy here. And where I live, I moved when I got married. I now live 7 miles due east of, I'm basically on the other side of the bay, 7 miles due east of San Francisco. I'm in the near East Bay, Alameda, Berkeley, Oakland. Market is torrid. It's crazy.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com.
If you're thinking of leaving your W-2 job and becoming a full-time real estate investor, one of the greatest costs you must consider is healthcare for you and your family. When I made this transition myself, I found the whole healthcare insurance process to be confusing and frustrating. That's why I'm glad I met Chad Creasy at RCB and Associates. Chad is a professional health insurance agent who helps real estate investors and small business owners understand and choose their best healthcare options. And best of all, his services are covered by the insurance company and won't cost you a dime. If you live in Michigan and are expecting a change in your healthcare insurance coverage for any reason, or losing employer coverage or transitioning into Medicare, then you owe it to yourself to contact Chad Creasy at rcbassociatesllc.com. You've had a lot of success, Roger, both in your business and obviously with the duplex that you just talked about. But one of the things we were talking about before the show and when I was on your show is some of the misses that you've had. And I'd love to kind of go over those. And I thank you in advance for sharing them with our audience, because you've had some really interesting experiences investing in real estate. You've seen the ups and you've seen the downs. And I'm wondering, if you can share some of those with us.
You know what? It's funny because I talk about these things now from a different perspective, only because time has gone by. But I will tell you, as they happened, as they were happening, and shortly after they happened, I had a deep sense of failure and shame and humiliation. And I had a really tough time forgiving myself for some of the decisions that I made. And enough time has gone by, and I've just created a different perspective, probably out of necessity, because how long can you live with that stuff? And how long can you flagellate yourself for some of the dumb things that you did? But if I were to rank in order of stupidity, I would say the dumbest thing I ever did, and there are many, and we did talk about them, you and I, before. My wife and I, we worked together on this stuff. We bought 14 residences in Buffalo, New York. It might have been maybe 17 units because there were some duplexes in there and maybe one triplex, all Section 8. And we paid all cash. And we were paying for the houses anywhere from, on the low end, we bought a couple for $25,000, and maybe on the high end, $35,000. And actually, I think, okay, then on the duplexes, maybe as high as 45 grand, thereabouts. This was mid 2000s. And we paid all cash. And my assumption was that because we paid all cash, the worst that could happen is we'd sit on a vacancy and we wouldn't be making money. And so in my mind, my uninitiated mind, thinking, well, the worst case scenario is zero. And then it's just a matter of how much money you make, since we had paid all cash.
Yeah, and that's a very conservative way to invest, paying all cash. You don't have to worry about the bank and the mortgage or being foreclosed on.
Well, I appreciate that, but lesson number one is that just because it's vacant and you paid all cash does not mean you're not losing money, because you have these little, nettlesome details, such as things called like taxes and insurance. And then in these neighborhoods, you had, friendly neighbors that would come by and steal your copper plumbing. And then you'd get fined from the city because there'd be some car in your driveway leaking oil, and this is, 15 plus years ago. So that this isn't even I'm sure I'm leaving details out. So you can lose money in a vacant property. You could be underwater. Lesson number one. The other thing is, it's probably not a good idea to buy something 3,500 miles away. And I will say this, amazingly enough, out of all the horror stories of bad property management, we had this woman who worked by herself in an office, and she did a great job. And if it weren't for her, we would have lost even more money. And what would happen was this, is if you had a renter in there at, let's say, $750 a month, which is why we bought it. We're thinking, the whole 1% rule, right? We're buying these things for, 35 grand and it's renting $700, let's say. It's not only the proverbial 1% rule, it's 2%. So we're thinking, holy cow, we're in the worst case scenario. I'm thinking it'll be 50% expenses, which would have equated to 10% cash on cash. In my naive mind, that was the worst case scenario. But here's what really happened is you have the thing rented for $700 a month. And yes, with Section 8, you do get your money from the government. If there's an increment that above and beyond that the tenant has to pay, because let's say they qualify for $700 a month and you're charging $800 a month, they have to come up with the other $100. Getting that was like getting blood from a stone. It was virtually impossible. So yes, we got our money from the government, but what would happen is they'd leave after a year And if you collected $8,400 a month, rather a year in rent, 700 times 12, I'm just throwing that out there. And that is about what the numbers were. They'd do 10 grand in damages. And then you'd sit on it vacant for 6 months. And I had an assumption that because I had watched a video, this was back in the age of videos, if you can imagine that Section 8 tenants stay a long time. And in some markets, maybe that's true, but in a market where, that's the Rust Belt, Buffalo had lost 50% of its population from its high water mark, let's say in the 50s to mid 60s. They'd lost half the population. So you'd sit on vacancies forever, and they'd leave at the end, of every year. So, I took a hit, probably 300-400 grand on that, and a lot of other dumb stuff too.
Thank you for sharing that with us, because I've heard the experts talk about how Section 8 is great because you get paid and your tenants, they want to stay and keep having their rent be paid. Let's go back to when you bought those. Were you looking for Section 8 properties, or how did you actually find these properties? What were they, like 3,000 miles away in Buffalo, New York? I mean, how did you find them?
Here's how we found out about it. My wife's hairdresser. And he's this guy. And I don't know why I feel so compelled to say this, but I'm in the Bay Area. He's a guy. I don't know why I feel compelled to qualify that he's actually straight. Now, that's an anomaly in the Bay Area. But my wife's straight, male hairdresser. And sorry for the political incorrectness, but he had gone there. He's a real estate investor and is to this day. And on a hairdresser's salary, of course, comes from a real estate family. He somehow found the whole Buffalo thing. I don't even know how he found them, but he came back after he bought a couple of them and was telling my wife about, these great houses, and oh my God, they're beautiful and they're huge. And, it's unbelievable. Again, coming from a Bay Area perspective, where you can't buy an outhouse for, less than $250,000, $500,000. He was just, oh my God, you won't believe it. That's how we found out about it.
It does seem like you may have thought, hey, you're buying C-class Section 8 properties. But in the description of what actually happened, it sounded like these were maybe the houses were nice, or the properties themselves were nice, but you were really renting to more D-type tenants.
Yeah, it's 100% accurate. Well, that was part of it too, is that we went in May. It is this month. We went in May. And, when you go in, as you're a Midwesterner, May's different than January. Okay. So it was a beautiful day, leafy neighborhoods. And yes, you're 100% correct. These were homes that were built. In other words, it was a huge mistake in hindsight, but these were homes that were built probably in the 20s in the heyday of Buffalo, which was a booming market, in that time, built on the automobile as those big cities in the Midwest, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, were. And yeah, they were gorgeous homes with incredible detail and hardwood floors. And we were like, wow, exactly. To your point, we were like, we'd live in these houses. They're beautiful. Yeah, sure.
Now, let me qualify what I mean when I say D-class tenants. I mean tenants who don't pay their rent. Even though they're getting Section 8, they're not able to pay the rent above and beyond Section 8, and the type of residents who would trash your property and cause you $10,000 in damage. That's what I mean when I say D-class residents.
Is there such thing as an F-class?
I think if there is, you may have found it. How would you have approached it differently looking back at it now?
I wouldn't have done it. And that's a good question. I feel like I'm at a loss for words, because the obvious thing is property management. Well, here's what I would have done differently. I would have talked to a property manager first, and we bought them directly from a seller, a guy that was a flipper, and we trusted him. And, I can't blame him for any of this, but I would have talked to property management first, because had I talked to even the woman that ended up managing these properties, had I talked to her, she was a pretty honest woman. She would have said, I would have shared my assumptions with her, like I probably would have said, well, hey, they stay for a long time, right? And she would have said wrong. And I think I would have known, I would have learned in advance what to look out for.
Finding the team members up front who could set your expectations correctly. That's what I take away from your story is like you were getting the story from the person selling you the properties, but not from the person who would eventually be taking care of those properties for you.
That's 100% accurate. Here's another thing that I said I would always do. And then of course I always break this rule because I get lazy and I forget. But there's another there, that for sure, Brian. The other thing is, had I made it a point to talk to other people in my position at that time, if I would have made it a point to say, let's say to the guy that sold my houses, give me a list of people that have owned these properties from as far away as California or Israel. Israel had like a lot of people buying homes and they still do actually in the US or Miami or wherever. And let me talk to people and I didn't do any of that.
I do know people who are very successful owning and managing D-class properties. But I think the reason they're successful is because they're very hands-on and they're there talking to the residents, collecting the rent, helping the residents when they can. And that's what makes them successful because they can dedicate the time to it. But if you're listening to this and thinking about investing in that type of property, but you're going to be remote or passive, your chances of success are greatly diminished because of that, I would say.
For sure. And, even at the time, I said to my wife, I said, there's money in this. But you'd have to be there, to your point. You'd have to be there. You'd have to live there. And I think you'd, even more than hands-on, I think it'd have to be your full-time business. That at least that class of property and that class of tenant, it'd have to be your full-time work. And then, you could systematize it and then scale it and have teams and you'd make actually pretty good money at it.
So, Roger, you have some other stories to share with us, some that sort of worked out, some that didn't work out.
Another one where we lost a lot of money is I knew a local broker. This is in the heart of the recession. So this is like 2009. And he basically was a leasing agent. And at that time in downtown Oakland, where my office was and is, although we moved, his name was on every vacant property. And so I just assumed that this guy knew exactly what he was doing. And then one day he came to me and said he got an SBA loan for this property, maybe 5,000 square feet, not a big property, small, but kind of a trophy property, kind of really, really cool. It was built in the probably teens of the last century, probably 1915, something like that. Cool building. It's a building anybody would be proud to have an office there, whether you were an attorney or a CPA or a yoga studio or whatever. And I assumed because he was a leasing agent that he really knew what he was doing. And as it turns out, I lost every penny that I put into that thing. He couldn't get it leased. We were undercapitalized. It was capital call after capital call after capital call to the point where I said, I'm no mas, sorry. And he had reached that point too, because we were 50-50 partners. He said, yeah, I'm right there with you. And, we lost between $250,000 and $300,000 on that. And, what did I learn there is that even though, yes, he was a leasing agent, and so I assumed he understood leasing, he had zero experience as a principal. And that's basically what I learned from that, zero. And I was just shocked at his lack of knowledge and his ability to run that property.
And this was a commercial office building?
Yeah, retail on the bottoms, 3 floors. So it's retail and an office in the top 2 floors.
Why do you think that he had this level of confidence that turned out to not really translate into success?
I don't know. Let's put it this way. Somebody that ultimately took the building over, basically just took over the payments and got the building, who small little, not really a huge coincidence because it's a small world in Oakland, I knew and still know and invested it in a deal with, took it over. And he just said to me one time, he goes, you know what? This person who shall remain nameless, even though nobody would know him anyway, is listening. But this person just has a screw loose. That's the way this other friend of mine described him. And it's just, there's just something missing in that I didn't pick up on. He's no longer in the market. I don't know what he's doing, but you got to take responsibility. It's I picked, I stepped up to the deal, and, I chose to do business with him. I don't know what was missing. You would think a guy that's all he does is lease this space, he would have a sense. And I could excuse the deal based on the fact it was in the deep recession. But what that doesn't excuse is the complete oversight on the CapEx that would have been required, because irrespective of whether that was 2009 or 2019, that building probably needed $500,000. Maybe that's high, but at least $250,000 in TI or CapEx to get tenants. And I wasn't that well capitalized, and nor was he. And there was no thinking about that. All of this I've learned, my takeaway on all this, you got to find people that know what the hell they're doing, that have done it time and time again, that have a formula. And then obviously all the personal stuff, you like them. Are they people of character that you can trust and all that kind of stuff? But looking for people that really have a lot of experience doing what they're doing.
And I think that the key thing there for me is the TI, the tenant improvements, because if you have an office or retail, as you sign leases and bring tenants in, well, a lot of times there's a certain amount of money that's negotiated that you're going to have to put into that space to build it out for that tenant. And if you don't have that cushion of money going in, then what you just said, the capital calls, where your partner was calling you saying, well, we need however much money to put into this space that we're about to lease out. You have to have access to that money. And if you don't, well, you could really find yourself in a hole, unable to contribute the TI money, and therefore unable to bring in the leases that you need to lease up the building.
And you know what, Brian, it was so obvious too. It would not have required a leap of imagination at that time to look at a property and go, well, nobody's going to rent this. And it's a small building, so you weren't exactly dealing with credit tenants or national tenants. It was the local jewelry stores, the local yoga studio. But even still, you look at a space and you could just look at it with your naked eye and not even necessarily knowing a lot about real estate. Because at the end of the day, I'm just an advertising guy. I don't know that much about real estate. But it wouldn't have taken a lot of common sense to go, nobody's going to rent that space as is. So guess what? It's going to take some money you have to put some money into it. So, it was me being, I was stupid. I just didn't really consider those things. I didn't know to consider those things.
Have you invested in office or retail since then?
No, I have not. Not that I wouldn't. Again, I mean, to me, it's like I'm very agnostic as to asset class, even to this day. So when, look, depending on the market and the submarket and the block it's on, there's an office building somewhere that's a great deal that could be fully leased up in a month just because, and even retail, I wouldn't dismiss completely out of hand. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'd be leery of it, but I don't think retail's dead. All retail is completely dead forever. It'll reinvent. I'm agnostic as to asset class. I mean, I think you have to go in with your eyes wide open, but even with, multifamily or self-storage or mobile home, it doesn't matter what it is. There's always a way to, stub your toe.
And I would think that right now, with retail and office being kind of beaten down by the pandemic, there's probably a lot of potential there to make money in those sectors. But you have to be well aware going in that you need that money for the tenant improvements, the TI. So if you don't budget that into your costs, then you'll be in the same situation you found yourself in.
Yeah, I mean, and again, if I'm talking to a guy that's been doing it for 30 years and says, gosh, we're buying it at pennies on the dollar, against replacement cost, and by the way, I have a tenant ready to sign a lease, right? Whatever it is, there's opportunities out there, and the way I look at it is all these other asset classes, I think, are just. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to get that, multifamily in particular, but there is so overheated and arguably overpriced in most markets, even secondary, in some cases, maybe even tertiary markets at this point, that you got to really look at it and go, well, how long does this thing keep going? Are we going on fumes here? I get the feeling that we are. And so in my mind, yeah, maybe, it's a contrarian play, right? I mean, to go into retail at this point, not that I'm ready to cut a check this second, but I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand.
I agree. You have some other stories for us.
Those were the big ones. Those were the ones I lost the most amount of money in real estate.
Let's talk about your 5-unit in San Francisco, your rent-controlled 5-unit.
Well, I didn't lose money on that one, Brian, but it, what a painful lesson. I'll tell you, opportunity cost. Had I put that money, I bought a 5-unit in 2015. I paid all cash because even before Buffalo, my wife and I, we bought like 20 houses, new houses at different parts of the country prior to Buffalo. Most of those houses went up like a rocket ship. This was in 2003 into 2004. And that took us, and we made like $1 million on those, but we were hanging on to some that we ended up losing a bunch of money. And therefore we foreclosed, which is another thing I was incredibly ashamed of. And so as a result of that, and I know this feels like a tangent, but the point is this: we had ruined our credit. And so in 2015, that 5-unit, we bought all cash and paid $1.5 million for it. Well, how did I come up with that amount of cash? The one thing I haven't screwed up is in my primary business. So it was just like a cash cow deluxe. So we bought this building in San Francisco, and coming out of the Buffalo experience, coming out of the Oakland experience, I'm like, I just don't want to lose money, period. And I'm not going to be a hog and get caught up on the upside. And I just don't want to lose money. San Francisco is a rent-controlled market. So it's 5 units. And the upside on just 5 units was like over $200,000 a year in income. Now, what I mean by upside is basically what the rents were and what the market rents were at that time. There was about a $200,000 delta. And that's even a little bit on the low side. And it's also conservative. So I'm thinking to myself, I'm a patient guy. I'm making a ton of money in my primary business. And I could wait. I mean, I could wait 10 years. I could wait 15 years. If 15 years from now, 20 years from now, I'm making a couple $100,000, $250,000 off an easy to manage, nothing 5-unit building in a path of progress neighborhood that was close to where I used to live, close to where that duplex is.
These are rent-controlled units though, right?
That's the whole story. They're rent-controlled units. So for example, there was a lady that lived on the top floor. She had been there since 1975. So in 2015, she had been there 40 years and she was paying $600 a month. And the market rent on that was $4,500 at that time.
Wow.
And so honestly, I'm thinking she was like 88 years old. And by the way, climbing steps. Now, albeit, yes, she was in good shape. I'm thinking, is she going to be climbing these steps at 98? I don't think so. So, and then every other unit except for one was similar situation, not as dramatic, but there was a guy that had been there 20 years. He was paying like $900 against and he had the biggest unit in the building. The market rate on his would have been $4,800, maybe $5,200. So I just thought I'll just be patient, and it cash flowed. Again, my return on equity was absolutely abysmal, but having lost money in those previous ventures, my frame of mind was I went 180 degrees, but it was just like, I just don't want to lose money. And if I have to wait 10, 15 years, I'm okay with that. Well, what I learned is that, when the woman upstairs had a daughter in her early 40s, and we were told we had a property manager who said, well, she only stays there one night a week. And when her mother dies, she'll be reasonable. I'm sure she'll leave if you pay her $100,000. This is what you have to do, by the way. in San Francisco. So whereas $100,000, if you're sitting here listening to this and you're in Tulsa or if you're in Chicago, it probably sounds like, oh my God, you have to pay somebody $100,000. The answer is yes, but I would have gotten that money back in 2 years, and the value of the building would have appreciated $500,000 just by that. And that's how that game works. Well, one morning, it was my birthday. My wife and I went in for to get brunch, and it was close to that property. It was a gorgeous, October morning in San Francisco. And hey, let's walk over and see the place. And we did. And it just so happens the old lady's daughter was on the stoop with another one of our, low paying tenants. And she was like, it was so clear that no, it wasn't. She wasn't living there one night a week, as my property manager described. She was living there full time and had been living there for years. The point being is that in San Francisco, if you were to try and say that, well, but she's not on the lease, you would lose that in court about 500 out of 100 times. So I'm like, we walked away and I said, we are selling the building right now, because you know what? She's never going to leave. It's $600 a month. And she loves the area. It's growing. Even if she has another place out in the suburbs, she's never giving the property up. And the lesson is that when people are paying that little, generally they leave when they die. And they just never, and even if they want to leave, if they want to stay in San Francisco, or if they're new, wherever it is, even if they want to leave and they go, well, the neighborhood's getting gentrified. It's not as native as it used to be, or whatever it is. Even if they want to leave, they can't, because they can't afford to pay rent anywhere else. And so we sold that. And, that was 2015. Had I invested that amount of money in any number of syndications in that period of time, or had I, bought stock in, more stock, I should say, in Google or Apple or, you name it, I would have made a lot more money. I ended up selling it to a guy that kicked all the tenants out to condo the units out. And I don't want to take up too much time, but he did it legally, but barely. And he wanted to partner with me on this endeavor before I did it, because I met him. And I'm not a particularly religious or a particularly superstitious person on the one hand, but on the other hand, I kind of thought, if I'm party to kicking these people out, I am going to go to hell. I mean, I'm sure I'm going to go to hell anyway because of stuff we're not going to talk about on this podcast. But I'm like, I can't do it. I can't kick these people out. He did it, and he's fixing it up, and he's going to condo them out. He'll probably make $1.5 million, do a couple $1 million.
That situation you were in really kind of drives home the pros and cons of rent control, because you have these residents who've been able to live there forever at a super low rent compared to the rest of the market. And that's great for them. But any investor like yourself doesn't have the opportunity to make any profit. So you're stuck with this decision. Like, you had to make the decision, would I go as far as to kick them out to condoize, because that's definitely a strategy, but you couldn't do it. But then the other guy could, and they got kicked out anyway. Being from San Francisco, and being that San Francisco is kind of held up as like the rent controlled area, that liberal sensibility, rent control, and everything that goes with it. What is your take on rent control?
I mean, I hate it for all the obvious reasons. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it really helps anybody, because here's the issue too, is that if you're telling me as a landlord that I could only increase somebody's rent 1.5% a year, that's about what it is. It might even be less. It might even be like 0.08%. I don't remember. But if there you are, you're paying your $900 a month because you've been there forever, and I could only raise your rent $9 a month. How am I going to upgrade your unit with that? So it doesn't do anybody any good. And I think, and yes, is from a landlord's perspective, it's hard to make money. It got the reason rent control got implemented. It was back in the 70s, maybe the 80s, because there was one landlord in particular that just passed away a year or so ago. He owned thousands of units in San Francisco, and he just raised everybody's rents mercilessly. And the city, thought that it was unfair and that it needed to be regulated. So I guess it plays a role in society to some degree, but my bark is bigger than my bite politically, meaning that I not that I'm left, but I can understand maybe the necessity for it in certain occasions. I mean, as a landlord, I hate it. But, I thought you were going to go in a different direction, which is for years and still to this point, as an investor, it actually is it artificially suppresses the value of property. It could be a great deal. But what I learned from it is you don't go in and buy something where people are 80% under market because they're never going to leave. But if you go in and buy where where the average, let's say the average is over, is let's say 30% under market, then those people can afford to leave. And there's a 30% delta. Then they're not going to cling and hang forever. Those people leave. And that's the lesson from me. So the whole model of buying something under rent controls, I think still holds, but you don't go where it's so under market where people are just literally will never leave till they die.
Yeah. So you have to do your due diligence on the residents as well, not just the property and the numbers. And I have talked to other investors on the show where their strategy is to buy rent control properties. They're paying $30,000 to $50,000 per resident to do cash for keys so that they can remodel the property, bring it up to market rents.
And the reason I didn't do that is because San Francisco is so incredibly litigious, number one. And my property manager at that time, who did a good job, he was so paranoid of even broaching this topic with the tenants. And so I just didn't do it. And I didn't want to get sued. Even bringing it up with a tenant, hey, would you consider, hey, I can help you relocate. You could be potentially stepping on a landmine, just broaching it with a tenant. That's how incendiary the environment is. I should say was. I think with COVID, I think the whole world changed around everything, including this. And the COVID's been the whole focus for the last 15 months. But I mean, prior to that, you would have people buy these buildings, because there's a pretty typical building in the Mission District of San Francisco. You would have a landlord buy a building like this, and you would literally have a protest of neighbors with the picket signs in front of, yuppie scum or, whatever the heck it is. Don't do this, don't do that. It is like a tinderbox. And I'll tell you, the guy that bought the building from me, he's been written up in the papers. I saw him in the San Francisco Chronicle a couple months ago. But this guy had cojones that I don't have. This guy was ruthless and fearless. And I got to be honest, I've just been a spectator. I respect what he's done, because he's like, F this, man. I'm holding all the cards. F the attorneys. F the city. It's my building. And I'll tell you, by hook or crook, he got every one of those tenants out. And I tell you, I respect what he did. Wow. I wouldn't have had the courage or the ability, the knowledge. I couldn't have done it. I'm too mod, but I don't know what I'm doing. I couldn't do that.
You have to have an appetite for public vilification to go down that route. But as a landlord and real estate investor, you were put in an extreme situation that most of us don't really experience. Having to face that decision. Can I kick my tenants out? Obviously, you came down on the side of no, and you sold it to someone who had no problem, no moral or ethical issue with it. But thank you for sharing that example, because it does bring up some of the moral and ethical issues we deal with as real estate investors. As we wrap it up here, any advice for our listeners? You've certainly experienced a lot of success in business for your advertising company for vocational centers, and you've experienced ups and downs in real estate investing too. What would you say to our listeners?
Get educated, and then after that, get educated some more and talk to as many people as you can. And I think that one of the smartest things you could do is whatever you're endeavoring to do, talk to as many people as you can that are currently or have done it. And I think that's the words of advice I would give.
And how would people get a hold of you or find out more about you?
You could get a hold of me at roger@streetsmartsuccess.com would probably be the best way. If you're really lonely and you need to talk to somebody, my phone number is 510-919-5142, or LinkedIn, of course.
Thank you for coming on the show. And I appreciate your willingness to share some of these painful experiences with our listeners, because they're so emblematic of what any serious and experienced real estate investor goes through, the ups and downs, the lessons we learn along the way. And I want to thank you for sharing those with us today. It's been a lot of fun talking with you again.
You as well, Brian. I look forward to future correspondence.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's higinvestor.com. And you can also ask questions and join us on Facebook by going to RPOA, Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast. This episode was sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com.
And RCB and Associates, helping real estate investors and small business owners navigate the complex world of health insurance and Medicare benefits at rcbassociatesllc.com.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.